As always, Nev, at the end, I will send the finished recording to you tonight. Uh,
Wonderful. Yeah. Can I say a few words to start?
sure, but before we do that, at the very end, I tell you, why don't you stay on for a moment at the end, Nev, along with Marie, and she can give you whatever information she needs for the honorarium. That way, I don't have to get it and then send it to you. Um,
Good.
is that agreeable, Marie, at the very end?
That's absolutely fine.
Okay. And still admitting. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the October CrimeCraft. And before we begin our discussion tonight, I'll turn it over to Chapter President Nev, and she will go from there. We'll go after she has whatever announcement she wants to make.
Thank you, Gary. Just very short notes. Apparently, there are a few people in the chapter who have forgotten to renew their subscriptions. So if you have gotten emails from MWA National, do click those links and go ahead and renew. There's a handful of people that have not yet renewed. And the thing is, we will end up dropping them from the list that get the announcements, in a few weeks. So that's one. If you are one of those folks, please renew. Secondly, we have our Revels scheduled for December 2nd. It's in Midtown Manhattan, a lovely location in M Social. We're going to start promoting this a lot more. It's already up on our Facebook page and it is going to be limited seating. It is a gorgeous seventh floor restaurant right in front of Times Square. So, a lovely location. And of course, that's when we're going to announce the winners of our Leon Burstein Award. The first time we're doing a cash award. Yes. So the scholarship has evolved into a contest with awards, and there'll be one finalist and one runner-up, or sorry, one winner and one finalist. Two winners, really speaking. So excited about that, and keen for everyone to be able to make it. It is going to be a weeknight. It's going to be 6:30 to 8:30, I believe, and we will do a lot more promotion for that. Again, you have to be a current member.
Yeah.
And this time,
Okay.
for the first time, maybe, we are doing plus ones. So bring your sweetie, bring your sweetheart, whoever they may be. And it is highly subsidized by the chapter. So we would like for all of you to come. I think that's it. I have to tell you, I read this short story by Marie maybe 6 months ago. It was in the Galaxy Press, one of the anthologies, and I loved it. It had to do with a wooden man, and that story haunted me. So I actually mentioned Marie Croke to Gary to say, "Hey, somebody who can write this well, like, come on, just bring her over," because there are mysteries in all kinds of genres. There are mysteries in historicals, mysteries in romances, mysteries in sci-fi, everything. And it's quite a trick to make it work. So, Marie, I'm thrilled to finally meet you virtually.
Thrilled to meet you as well.
And let me hand it back to Gary. He's always very good to, with doing this. You want to read the little bio maybe or jump into it? How should we do this?
Well, I'm going to do a brief intro without doing a bio. I'm going to let Marie speak for herself. Um, I've learned not to speak for other people. They're perfectly capable of doing it. But you're right. The topic tonight is going to deal with um, working across genres. And we've talked off and on about some of these things over the years where we have something like Isaac Asimov's Robots of Dawn or Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man, both classic science fiction novels, but also both mysteries at their heart. One, an actual murder mystery, and the other, an inverted mystery, and a la Columbo. So mystery drives people. There was a time in the 80s when 1 out of 5 passengers on a plane had an Agatha Christie in hand. I don't know who, I forget who had that statistic, but I did read an article to that effect shortly before Christie passed away. And unlike many attempts at fiction, a mystery is actually a pas de deux. We hope not a folly to do, but a pas de deux between a writer and a reader. And that's what makes them compelling. And all writers, I think, benefit from having those elements in their heads when they're working. And so we've invited Marie to come talk about that. And I'm going to let Marie give her own biography. It's an impressive one. And we'll go from there. Marie, I turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really stoked to be here tonight with you all. I am excited to get into the discussion as well later on. So just so you have kind of an overarching idea of how I'm going to talk, I do plan on introducing myself as a writer first and then as an editor, and then moving on talking about cross-genre book examples and some thoughts on trends before I give some examples using my short fiction of intermixing mystery with like horror, fantasy, and science fiction. Then I have some thoughts for discussion to jump us into chatting and hopefully generating some interesting ideas going forward. So as for me, as Gary and Nevis said, my name is Marie Croke. I'm a speculative fiction writer who loves interwoven mysteries and twists within my stories among the relationships that I write about. I especially enjoy speculative aspects that I haven't seen before or haven't seen done in certain ways. I first started writing seriously back around 2008, published a few short stories, and took a break from submitting because of work and very young children. And then I dipped my toes back into the industry around 2019 by challenging myself to write a page based on a prompt every day, and then pulled my favorites to actually submit. From that challenge, I ended up selling 2 stories, which showed me quite viscerally how shorter work tends to have a leg up within the short fiction markets when you're new in particular. Then I attended the Odyssey 6-week writing workshop in 2020 taught by Jean Cabellos, where we were the first year she did all online because of COVID, and 2 years before she restructured it into your personal Odyssey, which no longer have the round robin style critiques, which is both a boon and a pro negative, depending upon what you're looking for in a workshop. But this is where I came to the realization that horror was not outside the bounds of what I enjoyed, and so I stretched even further what I was writing. In terms of success, I started seeing I had 10 stories published in 2021, another 10 in 2022, and it continued selling, and I've been invited to some anthologies. I now have about 45 stories sold or published with a novel on submission through my agent. As for my love of cross-genre mystery and spec, just a bit about me from way back when. This came from a love that started early, as I'm sure is unsurprising. You have the famous Boxcar Children, of course, and the Encyclopedia of Brown books, and those coupled with Baum's Oz books, especially considering the twist at the end of The Land of Oz, began my desire for that mystery and spec intertwined. And then, of course, as Gary already talked about, the Asimov's robot books, I read those in elementary school, as one does, and kind of the rest is history. I also want to mention one of my favorite books of all time in the science fiction genre is a mystery story called Inherit the Stars by James P. Hogan, which is about a discovery of a dead man in a spacesuit on the moon who is carbon dated to have lived long before humans even evolved on Earth, leading to a push by scientists to solve this mystery of how this was possible. It's one of my favorite science fiction novels of all time. So that's me as a writer. As an editor, my editing journey has kind of taken place at the same time as my writing journey, in that I began as a slush reader for 2 different magazines back in 2020. Apex Magazine, it's a magazine that's been around for a while and was well respected and was coming back from a hiatus. It tends to publish a darker side of fiction that's still rather beautiful. And Choreo Magazine, which was a brand new magazine begun by Alexandra Hill for immigrants and members of diaspora. I had gone to Odyssey with Alexandra and had promised her that I would help volunteer as a slush reader there. I ended up being accepted to both of these places, and I'm working with them both for a number of years. About a year and a half after I started working with both of them, I was asked to please come help out at Dark Matter during their open slush period. So I hopped aboard over there as well and ended up having a much bigger role in choosing some stories that ended up being published in a magazine. After a year and a half, I was then promoted to acquisitions editor as the editor-in-chief and CEO, Rob Carroll decided to focus primarily on book publishing and not the magazine anymore. So as an acquisitions editor, I was looking through my submissions. The first book I have acquired for Dark Matter Inc. is a title called Psychopomp by Maria Dong. It's a psychological sci-fi thriller with kind of a retro vibe. So it takes place on a prison colony on a moon that is tethered to its planet, and touches on themes of mental illness and debt economy, while the main character works to solve a mystery around strange visions she's having while trying to survive. When looking for my first acquisition, I was taking a lot of things into consideration because I knew that this book was going to kind of set the stage for what people sent to me. So what people would expect from the books that I choose to champion. So I was looking for something that represented a lot of what I value and what I want to see more of. In this case, Maria's book has an adult protagonist. Not that I'm against younger protagonists in any way, but I do think that when writing for an adult audience, one must tread a little more carefully so that the voice is still attractive for an adult audience to read. And her book was fully science fiction. And I wanted to indicate that I was very much looking for spec stories and not just horror. I want dark fantasy stories, I want darker science fiction stories, and some horror that has spec elements. And it incorporates a lot of thematic elements that are super relevant to people today, which I think is highly important to when you're crafting stories, to have something like that within your story to kind of connect with the people who are reading it. I also have a major soft spot for mysteries, of course, and though we were calling this book a sci-fi thriller, there are a lot of overlapping elements when it comes to thrillers and mysteries, and I'm open to and love both the faster-paced thriller ones and the quieter, more contemplative mystery stories. So hopefully that gives a little bit of information. So what I'm looking for at Dark Matter, I'm always open to submissions of novels, novellas, aged and unaged that fall within those bounds. I would love to see some form of fantasy mystery or science fiction mystery in my inbox. So that brings me to talking about some examples of books that I personally loved. Some of you may be familiar, particularly some of the older books. So these are all stories that are cross-genre book examples. I know Nev earlier talked a little bit about like mixing mystery with romance and mixing mystery with science fiction and fantasy and horror. I feel like there's so many authors that have touched on some of these things over the years. So of course there's the aforementioned Asimov books that most of you are probably very familiar with. I think they really helped spark a love of science fiction in a wide amount of people. And there are also definitely elements of mystery in Philip K. Dick's work, and then more recently you have Tim Powers and Michael Crichton is considered a little more sci-fi thriller, but there's always those elements of mystery in some of those stories. And in fact, I would say that people like Michael Crichton and even, Philip K. Dick to some extent have paved the way for some cross-genre authors like Crouch. Some of you may be familiar with his books like Recursion that deals with a form of time travel in a science fiction thriller. It's reminiscent of some of the movies that have been crafted from Philip K. Dick's works, such as like Paycheck and Minority Report and others similar that were crafted around the same time period. And on the fantasy side, I did want to talk a little bit, kind of go in the opposite direction, because many of you are probably very familiar with urban fantasy or paranormal romance. Depending upon who you talk to, depends upon what the definitions of those two subgenres are. Yet ultimately, both of those subgenres, they encompass some form of fantasy elements that are normally quite overt, like vampires or werewolves or witches in New York City. And they're usually using mysteries as their plot through lines, sometimes with a parallel romance plot, but they're normally mysteries. They're normally fast reads, possibly predictable, but not necessarily. And though the fantasy aspects tend to mimic one another, there tends to be like little bits of each of them that kind of like try to stand on their own. What's interesting, unfortunately, that even though urban fantasy has fallen out of favor, because it's not as big as it used to be. It did have a giant boom. I would probably classify horror mystery like H.P. Lovecraft as that. Um, I'll get back to the chat afterwards. I feel like for urban fantasy and paranormal romance, even though we've had the big boom and then it has kind of settled a little bit, it's not as big. Generally speaking, it's not a dead subgenre at all, but there is a lot of people who are still writing it. Not just the people who are grandfathered in, of course, but the people who are just renaming it into something else. And very often that rename is just fantasy mystery. And so that is still out there and still a cross-genre work that is it is pretty big. It has a massive readership. Which brings me to kind of the now and some of the current trends in cross-genre work. We've seen quite a lot of new stories come to life that have really opened up some doors when querying novels that blend mystery elements with fantasy or science fiction. Um, I think that in some of the cases, they haven't quite, authors and publishers haven't quite taken complete advantage of some of these doors that occasional newer books have opened. One of them I want to talk about is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. Not so much her sequels, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with some of the more fantasy and science fiction ones that take mystery and kind of like really, really bring it out. But Gideon the Ninth is a mix of fantasy and mystery with a dollop of science fiction thrown in. It takes aspects of your typical closed circle of suspects trapped in kind of like a castle-like area that has become a puzzle where they're all being picked off one by one, and combines that with necromancy and bone wardens. It's a very death-heavy story, but with that dark aspect to it, it kind of opens the doors for another type of mystery, another type of mystery and fantasy mix. And because it's literally intermixing three different things, so it's intermixing fantasy and science fiction and mystery all at the same time. Right. Then this is my personal favorite in recent years. Seven Half Less Oven Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. I would hope that I hope some of you have read that one. Just so you understand, this is an Agatha Christie style story that throws in a huge amount of thriller aspects with fantasy vibes, with a character who's stuck repeating the same day over and over, like a groundhog idea. It also deals with the closed circle of suspects in a way because no one can leave the house or its grounds. So this one's interesting in that it's dealing not with the cross-genre work of fantasy and science fiction and then adding mystery, but it is rather it almost feels like it's starting as a mystery first and then using fantasy aspect with the time traveling Groundhog Day idea as sort of a background. It's there, but it's not really taking over the story. And then it adds a lot of thriller aspects to it, which isn't necessarily what you see a lot of in fantasy and science fiction, which is great. I actually have a little tidbit about that because Gary talked about Agatha Christie a little bit. If you've ever read The Hollow by Agatha Christie, that particular book clearly was a massive inspiration for Stuart Turton because there's a few elements from The Hollow that are heavily borrowed and put into the Evelyn Hardcastle book, including things like the reflection pool, Evelyn Hardcastle's name, a few other things. And then we also have another kind of intermixing that has showed up very recently, which I think is rather fascinating. If anyone has heard of books like Luke Arnold's The Last Smile of Sunder City, it's a noir fantasy, which takes the idea of urban fantasy and kind of turns it on its head a little bit by removing the magic with still having the characters there. So it's combining a mystery with fantasy in a completely different way. And I think this is a really interesting story, and it's a series. I think it's a really interesting one because it's really showcasing that like this is a new direction that urban fantasy can take. And it kind of is showing the different things that authors can go with. Because there's so many different aspects of mystery that doesn't have to be the same mystery over and over again that's being combined with specific types of urban fantasy. We don't have to always have sci-fi thrillers. We don't have to always have urban fantasy. We can do these different things, like this one with the noir and intermixing with fantasy. And I would be a little remiss. I'm bringing this one up just because I love it and I want more people to read it. So if anyone has heard of Tamara Siler Jones, she has written a series called Ghosts in the Snow, which is a full-on just fantasy murder mystery series. This was a few years ago. The first novel, The Ghost in the Snow, I believe it won the Compton Award. And they're absolutely fantastic if you like cross-genre works, because they are fantasy murder mysteries, and they don't even have these particular books don't have elements of the urban fantasy. They're not noir at all, but they are very much dark fantasy. I kind of wish they had taken off in terms of having a lot of people then go them, so that we would have a lot of different styles of these, which would have been fantastic. And then, of course, you have full detective fiction that intermixes with science fiction elements, which is things like The City in the City by China Miéville. This is a bit of a side note, but in terms of like all of these different types of intermixings of different kinds of mystery with speculative elements, Dark Matter Inc. probably wouldn't take things like The City in the City, but they would love things that are on the darker edge. So you have that dark fantasy story that's intermixing with a mystery, that dark sci-fi thriller that's doing something new. Those are definitely far more on the table, but I didn't feel like I could not mention The City in the City, as it is a pretty massive book that really did pull in detective work into this genre. So one of the things that I keep seeing in the trends in science fiction and fantasy and the horror genres, that's primarily where I come from, is that you see a successful story, or a successful story that intermixes mystery and it mixes with speculative fiction. It gets a massive amount of attention for a little while. And then the industry seems to sort of segue from that mystery element. I want to go back to Gideon the Ninth just to give kind of a few examples of this, as the sequels don't have the same level of mystery in them, but not even counting the author for that series, just in book publishing itself, because other authors will then use these mysteries by crossovers as their comps for their queries or submissions, but then they won't actually have a mystery in their story. So they will instead be focusing on different elements of the really big story that got really big because of the intermixing of mystery with those fantasy or science fiction elements, or those horror elements, and then sort of not take advantage of them to the same extent. In fact, with this particular book, Gideon the Ninth, it's essentially it's a fun, dark, bone-filled, closed circle of suspects murder mystery with a twist ending.
I didn't take you.
But rather than talk about that as it's represented as for cops, people will quote
All three pink
call
ones.
it lesbian necromancers in space,
Okay.
and that's what they will use as that's what they boil it down to. And then if you then use the comp, a lot of the authors will then use the comp and only use those kind of elements, and you'll notice that it's necromancers in space. So in the speculative world, we are looking at the fantasy aspect, the necromancers, and the space aspect, the science fiction aspect. And we're almost discounting the mystery aspect, despite the fact that there is clearly a massive desire for that mystery element. So it's interesting to me, and I just kind of wanted to point that out a little bit, because I feel like this is happening repeatedly in the industry and on the spec side. That's where it feels like mystery keeps seeping into things and doing really well. People are looking at it, they're loving the story, and then they're copying the other aspects of the mystery of the story, the fantasy aspects or the science fiction aspects. So to me, that feels like there is kind of some open doors here. I do want to talk a little bit. I'm going to segue. I'm not sure if anyone in here is interested in YA, but I feel like I should talk about YA just a little bit. because it is another cross-genre work. It has a lot of potential. If you are not familiar, a few years ago, a book called One of Us is Lying came out by author Karen McManus. The book, essentially, for those who haven't read it, began with a handful of students at a high school who were all forced into detention together, where one of them ends up murdered. Obviously, the only people in the room are the other students and the teacher, so one of them has to have been responsible. An investigation goes underway. So this particular book hit massively big. So big, it practically spawned its own genre. With this YA thrillers, you go into any big box store, you walk down those aisles, you're going to be seeing stories on the side, Karen McManus's new one, but then also all of the other books that have essentially echoed her, her cover. So all of these books that are kind of encompassing this new YA thriller vibe, but they're really not thrillers in like the typical idea of what you might think. They're very often mysteries that are just parsed down with a lot of the prose parsed down because of typical YA writing styles. And so it's just fascinating how big that got, how fast and big that got. And it's still today very, very big. And before this happened, you did not see these. You did not walk down the aisle and see, YA thrillers, YA mysteries. It wasn't a thing. So this is very, very new. And so that's a new cross-genre piece that actually took off, which is fantastic. I bring this up because there's also a few YA fantasy stories that have gotten big that have some mystery to them. A little bit, I think Shay Earnshaw had The Wicked Deep, and then there's another one that has to do with a wood. Erin Craig did some fantasy, kind of like murder mysteries that started with The House of Salt and Sorrows. And these books have become massively popular. But like I said before, they're rarely called mysteries, which is shocking to me because it's what they are. So instead, the publishing is focusing on, the romantic, through line that's in it, or they're focusing on the fantasy aspects. So I'm just bringing these up because I think that there's kind of a dearth, there's a space here for anybody who's interested in writing YA, who's interested in those crossovers, taking this hugeness from the YA thriller / mystery subgenre that is really big right now and interweaving it with the clear desire for these mysteries in fantasy YA. So I'm just putting that on the table as something to maybe consider. So this is all long work, of course, that I've been talking about, novels, novellas. I haven't really gotten into TV shows. Of course, you're probably all familiar with a lot of those. But because most of my personal writing work has been in the speculative short fiction world, which I also think enjoys integrating mystery elements from time to time, depending upon the author, of course. I know I personally do. Though I also know there are a lot of speculative authors who don't gravitate in that direction, which is good for those of us who do, maybe a little less competition. But given that that is something that people do enjoy reading in terms of the cross-genre work with mysteries integrated with spec fic in some way, I want to talk about writing this particular brand of cross-genre with some examples in the short fiction work. So speculative fiction is kind of an umbrella term. So I do want to break that down just a tad when it comes to integrating mystery elements into it, because I don't think all forms of spec are created equal when considering how to intermix them when crossing genres. While mystery isn't exactly built into horror, I do think it's easier to add mystery, or at least a mysterious element to horror in comparison to other spec subgenres. Some of that's because science fiction and fantasy require explanations. And explanations require words, and more words make stories longer, which can often lead to them not remaining short stories. But for speculative fiction, it's kind of part of its charm and its challenge in some ways to keep stories short while also making sure that your reader understands whatever magical or scientific creation you've cooked up. With horror, though, especially contemporary horror, there's less work to be done on the writer's side to be sure the reader knows what's going on. So I'm actually going to read a few examples. These are just beginnings of a couple of my stories that integrate different types of speculative fiction with mystery or mystery elements. And I'm going to start with the smallest example, which is from a horror mystery story called How many crab pots does it take to destroy a neighborhood? That was originally published in Dark Moon Digest. These are just the first 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph is barely more than a line. So, how many crab pots does it take to destroy a neighborhood? Most folk had their own, of course. Cages smelling of brine, kept tucked under the deck all winter, only to be tossed off the end of the pier come summer. Their disappearances started slow, picking at individuals, and didn't get so much as a question in the neighborhood until poor Mr. Hughes' house got swarmed with cops and the ambulance whined so loud the baby next door shrieked in harmony. You'd think that those 2 things wouldn't have a thing to do with one another. You'd think. So that's just the first 2 paragraphs. This story then goes on to investigate both Mr. Hughes' death and the disappearances of all the crab cages. And it slowly unravels how the 2 things are connected as more and more people die, and the protagonist actively witnesses a crab crawl up out of one victim's mouth to incorporate the horror element. So in this intermixing of horror and mystery, I actually thought I was writing a spec mystery when I first started. But I then got told actually by a friend, like, oh, hey, you should submit this to horror magazines, and it immediately sold then. So I do think I want to talk about how this is the easiest genre to intermix with mystery, in my personal opinion, unless you're talking about, maybe some thriller things, which that's parsed down the word count a little bit, or the writing style a little bit. You can wax on a little bit prettier in horror. Horror kind of uses the words that you're using, the prose that you're using to kind of evoke the horror, and whereas thrillers tend to try to scrape down some of those words to get you through it faster. So I do think that this is one of the easier times to intermix mystery with horror, because horror usually takes place in very familiar places, reducing how much exposition is needed. And the very nature of mystery itself can embody the depth that is found in at least murder mysteries or mystery adjacent to murder mysteries. So you'll notice I didn't have to explain nearly anything in that example. I presume you know what all the things are that I mentioned. Crabs and piers. Some of you maybe even have gone crabbing before. So somebody has asked, are you saying the horror's narrative devices reduces the exploratory aspects of mystery? So I'm going to pull that back up so I can actively see that. I don't necessarily think it reduces the expository aspects of mysteries. I think clearly it will depend, which is a bit of a cop-out to answer. However, I feel like with horror, you have a little bit of leeway when it comes to introducing horror. So when you are crafting a horror story, you don't have to start out with the horror on page 1. The horrifying thing doesn't work as well if it's on page 1. It actually works a little bit better if you have a little bit of tension and suspense and like hints about that horror, and then slowly bring the horror up. Whereas in mysteries, you do kind of need to start it very close to page 1. It doesn't have to be page 1, but it needs to be pretty close. Because in that regard, you then need the plot to start. And in a mystery, that's how the plot starts, is the mystery. For horror, that's not where the plot starts. So because of that, because of those 2 separate introductions of the horror and the mystery, I do think that I don't think you have to pull down away from your devices in mystery aspects. And instead, you're just kind of like blending them together a little bit better. Hopefully that answers that question, but we can always talk about it a little bit more too. So that, I don't necessarily know if it's an understand. I feel like I'm bringing up a lot of thoughts, and I think it's a fun thing to think about, because everyone's going to kind of bring their own ideas to their stories. And so if you're intermixing horror and mystery, you might intermix it a little bit differently. And I think that's important as well. But so for this particular piece, so that was the example for that. I do have another piece. I'm gonna kind of like segue into fantasy stories, because I think the fantasy stories, depending upon what you're doing, they can be just a little bit more difficult. The next piece I'm going to read is the first 2 paragraphs of a fantasy story of mine called Like Ladybugs, bright spots in your mailbox. It was published in Diabolical Plots. And again, I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs for this one. Someone began sending handwritten spell-crafted postcards out of DC in July of 2024. Those postcards made the rounds for a good 9 months, under the radar, scarcely observed. That was, until the rush of good health and the proliferation of wealth and the sudden uptick in good living, coupled with a grand downtick in big socioeconomic issues the mayor was quick to claim as her own, such as suicides and unemployment, brought the situation to the attention of the East U.S. Coven. Because we can't have downticks in unemployment and upticks in good health, not if there's witchery being waved under everyone's nose, especially if the handwriting has a particularly feminine flair. No siree. So this was published a few years ago. 2024 was a few years off when it got published. So this story doesn't start with a death, but it does start with an investigation to determine who is sending out these unsanctioned magical postcards around DC. And the story's climax does involve that discovery. So as I said, there's no horror elements in this story whatsoever. It is fully a fantasy story. But you will notice it's a contemporary setting, just like the previous example. It does not need a lot of things explained. I don't need to tell you what DC is. Not only that, but it's referring to very typical fantasy things like witches and covens, and both of those, again, don't need very much explanation for people to have at least some semblance of an idea what I'm talking about. So you can almost compare it a little bit more to that urban fantasy, which again, huge and right. And so it's very firmly fantasy and written in a different style than the Crowdpot story, but it also has a built-in, like a few easier things that you don't have to do quite as much as the author to get the reader on the same page with you. And that might be part of the reason why, urban fantasy was so big. But I want to go into a third example that is also fantasy, that takes things a little bit further and makes things a little bit more difficult because now it's secondary world fantasy. For those of you who aren't aware of what secondary world fantasy is, it's just fantasy that's not in our world, generally speaking. So you end up with a lot of explanation to do. So I'm just going to read the very beginning of the story. It's called Turn to Stone Ourselves and was originally published in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, which is a magazine that specializes in publishing secondary world fantasy. We turned to stone during the day, stiff and still along the rooftop causeways, listening to all that happened and unable to respond in kind. I learned secrets I repeated during the night, many of which were inconsequential to all but those involved. But there came one, just one, that clawed me to pieces with its heartache and left me a wretched half-thing. Her name started as Hima, a good child name, combining her infant name He with the more adventurous Ma, so that the sum of her name was beloved and audacious, perfect for a little girl naked, running the keep corridors and causeways, her hair a whirlwind of tightly woven curls that frizzed at the touch of a brush. She had a voice that pierced my stone ears, so I could always triangulate where she played, but it wasn't possible for me to turn my neck while the sun beat down on me. She had an imaginative game, one that left fairy dye depicting intricate drawings of people and creatures in flight across my skin whenever I stretched my limbs. After a long stay stiff, left me with the dreams of my youth 1,000 years past. 1,000 years since I'd run mountain paths with a name half shared, Loma, which claimed me to be both innovative and audacious. She disappeared one day, right after her 12th birthday, an anniversary that first lifers cling to like my claws cling to stone, which made her disappearance all the more wrenching for those who loved her. For me. At night, when I could roam, I walked the walls and flew the perimeter of the keep, and then I stretched farther, out across the city. I sought Hema in the darkness, listened for her high voice with its lilting happiness, heard her in the echoes of the keep as most slept on, oblivious to the little girl who'd gone away to never return. So a few things you might have noticed right off the bat is I started with exposition in this particular sample that was fully used to explain speculative elements that will not just be used in the story, but are paramount to the understanding of the story and the mystery that is coming that will be revealed later. Without those explanations, without the understanding, if I don't tell you that how my main character lives and the way that they turn into stone and come back and how it's their second life. They don't tell you the naming convention in this world, and the mystery won't make any sense, and the solution won't be something anyone can be satisfied with. So there's a lot of added words to get to that mystery, which is something that is pretty prevalent across all secondary world fantasy stories. Um, I do have a specific science fiction example, but I'm not going to read it because of the fact that I feel like it's a similar idea. Science fiction can very often, depending upon the kind of science fiction, can often lead to a lot of that extra exposition as extra words. Um, and if it's a difficult technology that you've crafted, it can take up even more time. So that's just an example of how it can take a little bit to get to that mystery aspect to it, because you have to kind of set the grounding for these mysteries when you're trying to intermix it with a fantasy aspect or a science fiction aspect that is different than the norm, different than, the witches, the vampires, the werewolves. Still, I think very rife for, people to write. I think they're far more intriguing just because of the fact that they haven't been played with as much. I think that there's an open area here for playing with them. I do want to do a small side note because I am talking to a bunch of mystery writers. Not all speculative fiction stories solve the mysteries they create. Oftentimes, especially in short fiction, because of the limited word count, the mysteries that are introduced are sort of left as mysteries. I personally think that there's an argument to be said that those mysteries are then precluded from actively being mysteries, which is a discussion topic potentially. So in each of these stories that I use as an example, they are all solved mysteries. So I do view them as actual mysteries. So I wanted to segue into maybe some discussion, like I brought up a couple of things. And so I first wanted to talk about, again, kind of going a little bit more into this separation between the way mystery writers are approaching things and thinking about things and the way speculative fiction writers approach things and think about things. Just as a kind of a humorous story to start off this kind of discussion. One of the things that I personally see on social media and discussion forums is people talking about the locked room mystery that they're writing. You see that a lot. Now, I don't run in mystery circles. As I've said, I'm a speculative fiction writer, and I'm a speculative fiction running in those circles. And so, when it's somebody talking about that, it's a speculative fiction writer talking about it. Which is to say, often enough, maybe this will get a chuckle out of some of you. I cannot think of a single time where a speculative fiction writer has told me that they are working on a locked room mystery when they actually mean a locked room mystery. They almost always mean a closed circle of suspects. I really can't think of an example otherwise. It's like the mystery terms, and I fully admit, I'm sure all of you are very, very well versed in terminology in the mystery subgenre, terms that I don't even know very well. But there are certain things that I do know. And so finding this in the speculative fiction market it's just kind of interesting. It's a funny thing. You can almost compare it to people who come into writing romance and decide, well, I'm going to do something different. I'm not going to have a happily ever after. I'm not going to have a happy for now. And then you're kind of going, well, and you're not really writing romance, are you? So I do think it's important to kind of have a good gauge of the different genres that you're intermixing and knowing what you're talking about. That's not to say you have to know everything, but I do think that it's just a little funny story. I was thinking we could open up for discussion there about those differences. One more thing before we did that, because I read a book recently with Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if any of you have read any of his. Okay, some nods. The book that I was reading was Blink. And this one is a book, it's nonfiction, for those of you who haven't read, he dissects this idea that our subconscious mind is instinctively seeing and judging things based on evidence in front of us in split seconds, such that you kind of have a feeling, like a gut feeling about what you're looking at. However, this only generally works best or at all when the person who is doing what Gladwell calls a thin slicing is instinctive thoughts decision based on only a few seconds, is super experienced in that particular subject matter. And as mystery writers, watchers, connoisseurs. It means that when you open up a mystery story, whether it's like a regular mystery story or if it's intermixing with science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, YA, that you are probably thin slicing in those moments. You're like, you're capturing those things. So I would love to be able to kind of open this up, talk about maybe the pitfalls that might occur when a mystery writer decides to combine science fiction and horror. What are they going to be looking at here? Because, maybe they're not seeing things in spec fic that, the other spec fic writers see. Um,
Okay. First, let me thank you and commend you for the detail you gave there. I will say that as a mystery writer who has read a lot of speculative fiction, in fact, I'm old enough to remember when the term speculative fiction began and began to push science fiction off to the side. Um, I very much enjoy what you said about the locked room, because we have one perception of what a locked room mystery is, and it's completely different from what people might think it is. But in terms of understanding our own fields, I will say something that's probably true of a lot of my colleagues here. I have an ex-wife who used to get mad as hell at me because we'd sit down to watch a movie together, and somewhere in there I'd say he did it. She was like, "How? Why do you do that? How do you know?" I said, "He did it."
Yes.
And I suspect that happens a lot, because those impressions come because we do enough with that. And I also liked one of the things that you, when you mentioned Gladwell, you're pointing out connections that happen that work on, they're not necessarily subliminal levels, but we understand them. And I can think of one from the novel Salem's Lot. And today somewhere I read a review of the new film adaptation. But one of my favorite lines in the novel Salem's Lot, and I read that, what, I don't know, I was probably 45, 50 years ago. A little boy sees a vampire. A little boy wakes up as a vampire, and he doesn't know what's happened to him. But then he felt the hunger, and with the hunger came understanding. And that's just a little hook for the reader who's familiar with the vampire mythology to go along with that. But when you talk about secondary worlds and you're doing something with a person turning to stone, you found little things in there to, for example, you mentioned a keep. And that's something that is, it may be in a secondary world, but it will act as a bridge between our world and the secondary world we're reading about. So I think that's important, finding those little hooks, lots and lots of little hooks. We take comfort in them because they're a moment of clarity. We know what's going on. Now, open it up to questions, comments at this point. So you can unmute yourselves, and unless we get really, a lot of people are clamoring to speak at once, feel free to jump in.
If I might start, Marie, thank you. I am in awe of your memory. All those names of books you rattled off, I'm reaching to just type out the first few words and you're off onto the next one. So amazing. Now, I'm going to ask you at some point to just jot a few of those down into the chat so that people can pick up and, educate themselves or just dive in or experiment, whatever the case may be. But they
Of course.
sounded fascinating.
We do have questions in the chat that could be asked aloud. And then, George, what are your thoughts on modern retelling of mystery classics? That's certainly something that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, mystery classics. So in terms of, I'm not sure what the conversation or what this question truly means. Like in terms of, do I want to see them? I haven't read any off the top of my head, other than I can say that Evelyn Hardcastle clearly is taking a lot of elements of the Hollow and kind of doing something very, very different with it, which would be an old Christie work. That's, but I think that it's awesome, especially since the thing is that a lot of the older stuff, well, we might know some of it, like, Neb was just saying, like, the stories that I'm just throwing out there, like, these are stories that I'm familiar with, like, very, very well. Like, these are stories that I love. So to me, it's not something that I throw out and I'm like, oh, I'm racking my brain. Oh gosh, like, what was the Evelyn Hardcastle book again? What was getting, like, I don't have to do that because it's so familiar. But then you guys you all have your own stories that are just as familiar to you and that I haven't read, that I have never touched. And I think that's important to remember because like we're all going to be writing from the perspective of what we have read and what we've experienced. So I personally think it would be fantastic to write, to have more modern retellings of classics just because of the fact that it will introduce more people. Like just as an example, this is not a mystery necessarily. It's technically termed a horror. It's a novella by Ursula, I think she said T. Kingfisher book. Her name is also Ursula Vernon, but it's a retelling of, I think it was called What Feasts the Dead is her book, and it was a retelling of one of Edgar Allan Poe's books or stories, short stories, and she turned it into a little series. And so I really think it's fantastic to see them. I think it introduces mysteries and classic these classics like to other people. In fact, I hadn't read a whole lot of Poe, and it made me go read this story by Poe. So I think that if you're interested in doing those, I think they're fantastic. And if you have recommendations of stories that you think are, intermixing things done really well right now, I would love to hear them as well.
I think one of the things to remember with classics is that sometimes redoing a classic works and sometimes it doesn't work at all. I'm speaking next week to a Sherlock Holmes group, and they invited me to come talk about actors who played Holmes. But what they're doing is the story we're reading for this particular meeting is The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. And as part of my preparation, I looked at the Jeremy Brett adaptation for the BBC. And that was one of the worst adaptations I have ever seen. It takes a fairly simple story and tries to turn it into a Hammer film, so it doesn't really work. But then if we flip to Benedict Cumberbatch in the modern adaptation of Sherlock from the BBC, A Study in Pink was a variation on A Study in Scarlet that worked beautifully. So sometimes that'll work and sometimes it will fail miserably. And not just in terms of a mystery, but also a classic piece of science fiction. Um,
I can't say that that is incorrect. I think some of that comes down to seeing, I mean, the author's own personal capabilities of
mhm.
intermixing them, but it almost kind of goes back to a little bit of, does the author, or if it's a pastiche show like you were mentioning, do they know why it was successful? And do they understand the differences between the audience it was successful at then and the audience that you're attempting to reach now, which could be different.
Yes, yes.
One
Anyone?
author, sorry, just occurred to me that one author that's doing that very successfully is Neil Gaiman. I did a master class that he has up and literally asks us to rethink simple things like Sleeping Beauty, you know. We all know the traditional story, but wait, you know, blood-like lips and white skin, and she sleeps during the day. And I'm going, okay, so suddenly it never occurred to me that the stepmother might be the hero of the story. But, you know, rethinking things that we think we know adds not just the element of surprise, but it's another kind of enjoyment. It's an, oh my goodness, I never imagined kind of enjoyment. I will admit I'm not much of a fan of horror. I'm chicken totally. I am too scared to watch them, especially at night. And Stephen King, no thank you, terrifies me. But maybe that's the point. Some people enjoy getting terrified. I think what I enjoy more than anything is the novelty, the difference, something that came out of nowhere and made me rethink something I thought I knew, like Sleeping Beauty. Um,
Yes.
so there's a question at the tail end of this. Marie, for you, what's the particular enjoyment in the mix of sci-fi with mystery with what part of you gets tickled?
Oh, um, oh goodness, I bet you could ask that with like anyone here.
Yes.
So I will say I think about this a lot. There's a subgenre, and I personally I don't like crapping on other subgenres just because I don't like it. However, there is a certain thriller-ish subgenre that I don't particularly enjoy reading. I don't get much out of it. Like I have tried Lisa Jewell before, and I discovered that she's not for me. And a book similar. And I really try to figure out, well, why is it? Why do I not like these stories? And it came to the realization that it's because it's not a puzzle to me. Like if you reveal what it is, it's not a puzzle to me anymore. I want the puzzle. I want to figure it out. Um, and it kind of it's a brain engagement. I want to try to piece all the pieces together. And if you're reading a mystery that the pieces aren't all there, sometimes I get frustrated. So when I'm working on my stories, it's one of the things I actively think about. Like, do I have enough hints here that a discerning reader, somebody who's coming from mystery, say, like who has read mystery stories, they understand what to look for. Would they be able to like piece them together and figure it out? Because I would like some of those people to do it. In fact, when I'm writing, one of the things that I do on a constant basis is I want 50% of my readers to get the twist or the reveal right before it happens. And I want 50 of them not to get it and for me to have to explain it right after. And if I aim for that, I
Right.
feel like I'm capturing that puzzle feeling that I really love because I want there to be people who read it and go, yes, I figured it out. Because isn't that like it gives you that dopamine rush, right? I'm sure everybody in here, I mean, you're all mystery, readers and writers. You probably have that same idea. In terms of like intermixing it with science fiction and fantasy, um, in that case, it's just a lot of the wonder, like the outside of the world, something that's a little bit different. I'm not necessarily going to say like I would love to find a portal to a different world, but the feeling could be there. So intermixing those two things kind of intermixes some of my favorite things in the world. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah. I totally get that, the wanting to put it together. And that's why we try as mystery writers to play fair to the reader, not to come out at the end with a totally new character and, page number 400 did it. Like, ah. So yes, we have to play fair. And I love when we have enough little bits in there that people can figure it out. And then those that don't, I enjoy even more surprising them. It's a fine balance, but that's delicious. And I didn't think about it, but you're right. The sense of wonder or escape or just
Mhm.
totally, taking your mind to new scenery. That's a lovely way to think about it. Thank you.
Keep in mind also that technology that goes toward solving mysteries is speculative fiction or science fiction at a given time,
Yeah.
because DNA reveals a lot these days, but something like DNA 50, 60, 70 years ago would be a revolutionary device in a mystery story,
Mhm.
like before fingerprints and after fingerprints.
Mhm.
Those are different things. I mean, before fingerprints, you might have had the Bertillon
Measurements, yeah.
measurements. The I'm trying to think of what would the anthropometrics or something, where you're measuring ears and faces, but then also and um I did use in my last book, in fact, something said, well, maybe you didn't realize this, but it's fear ID. And I said, fear ID. I said, that's what it sounds like to you, but it's forensic ear identification because ears are like fingerprints and so forth. And and there was a time when that wouldn't have made sense to people. So speculative fiction becomes in dribs and drabs. And you're right, in terms of creating a technology that's too complex for people to understand, which is why you need those little hooks along the way. One of the biggest complaints for Star Trek over the years was technobabble. They just run through so much stuff to explain how the ship is working. But and if they they create stuff along the way, and you're thinking, what is that? But then when you heard dilithium crystals enough times, it made sense. Oh, there's a problem with the dilithium crystal, so they can't get any propulsion. Then you've been brought into the world. So, another comment, question?
I did put a couple of the cross-genre mystery and spec fic stories that I mentioned into the chat, and I also pasted where I copied over the ones that were Vincent that you mentioned. So thank you for those.
You're welcome.
I wrote a lot of Harlan Ellison too, just way back when I was a kid. Loved Harlan Ellison. He did just a revolutionary science fiction writer. I never felt confident to write science fiction because I didn't think my science was good enough. But I have published a couple time travel stories because I really don't need to explain the technology for that.
There's another question on the chat.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. Yeah, 5 new messages. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Inherit the Stars, Philip Wiley. Okay.
Well, we're catching up other questions from the group. Now's your time.
How would you classify Shaban's the Yiddish Policemen's Union?
Yeah.
Going to admit I have not watched this or read this. I don't know. I cannot answer this question. I will have to go look this up.
Okay.
The reason I brought it up is because it takes that idea that you were saying, Miss Marie, about what if Alaska became the Jewish state as opposed to Israel, and that becomes the setting of the mystery and everything, and so then the Hasidim are now the gangsters of this new Israel, and that kind of, and the idea being that I mentioned it simply because you said that beginning part, how you set up the story, then allows you to do everything else. So like in that particular case, once you do that, then it's easier just to believe that all the other stuff would happen because now you're in a completely different world. So the purpose of the question was, what are some of the things we need to think about when we use speculative fiction in that way? We create that not to like an alternative world, like Man in a High Castle kind of thing, an alternative history, and then we begin whatever we do. How would you speak to that? What are some things we should keep in mind?
So it kind of feels like this, it's an alternative world from what you're saying. I kind of almost think that it's very similar to The City in the City in a way. So it
Yes.
depends upon how much you want to reveal to your readers at any point. The City in the City was interesting because of the fact that it doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't explain away all of the differences. And it kind of like you have to read a few chapters before everything clicks in your brain and you get it, you understand everything. So I feel like if you are trying to go for something like that, I think that is, I can't speak to this particular story, but if it's trying to go for something like that, I think that it doesn't need to then classify itself right up front. That it can just say, this is the alternative and we're going straight forward, through this. We don't have to sit here and explain it because the characters won't be thinking about it. They won't know the other world. They will have to think this is my world. And so you will have to find little key pieces, like, Gary was using the word hooks earlier. You would have to find those to kind of like sneak them in as you're writing because unless you're trying to go for maybe objective fiction, which in that case you can kind of just state it all. Objective fiction, I think, isn't written as much, but maybe some mystery writers here can tell me otherwise if, mystery has been picking it up a little bit more. But if you're trying to do it in a perspective, I would say do it like The City in the City, where this is your world and this is the protagonist world, and just, like give little bits to your reader at a time.
Thank you.
Marjorie has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry, I was off before. I'm just wondering, Marie, if one is going into the real crossing of the genres that you were talking about, like a science, a mystery, and so forth, sci-fi, do you have any thoughts about what POV works better, or does it? To me, POV is always so important. And how do you feel that fits when one is really making these connections, trying to bring in a secondary genre?
Yeah. So I know Nev said that she does not read Stephen King. Has anyone else read Stephen King's short story, The Boogeyman? Yeah, okay. So he's one person. Okay, a couple people. So The Boogeyman is written in objective perspective, and it is told outside. So it's fantastic. It's a fantastic story. If you can handle a little bit of horror, it's not super bad. And it is my personal opinion, a great example of a mystery story. It's one of those mystery stories that you can read twice and realize like something different, like your second time through. And I think that that's a great example of an objective short story that takes the advantage of not knowing what's inside of your protagonist's mind and not knowing anything that they're thinking. With that being said, objective is only used when you really, really, really are going to do like a boogeyman type style story. So otherwise, I would say, you go for that first or the third, depending upon how much you want to be revealing. Clearly, if you're in a first person, okay, so I'm going to be a slightly bit judgmental here. So hopefully I don't offend anyone with this comment. But I personally think that having too many first person characters who are hiding too many things from the reader that are then used as the twists or the mystery elements that are revealed can actually decrease the amount of satisfaction your reader gets. So if your thought process is, I'm going to have things that my characters know, but I don't want my reader to know, and those are going to hinge on your mystery aspects, I would personally go with third, just to have that separation a little bit so that maybe you could have the character pseudo think about something, but you're not in their perspective completely like in first person. So you're not tricking the reader. You're not lying to the reader quite nearly as much. Now, of course, there is a caveat. If you are trying to create a first person perspective and the goal is to make a liar, of course, go for that. But so those are just my thoughts on when and where you would use the different perspectives, because it just really depends upon the kind of mystery you're looking to craft.
Gotcha. Yes, thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome.
Counterfactual sometimes would form the basis of a good mystery. Len Dayton's novel SSQB is essentially a murder mystery set in a world where Germany won the Second World War. That's the two most common themes in counterfactual novels or alternate history novels are the South winning the Civil War and Germany winning World War II, both of which have been done to death. But seems to me in speculative fiction, counterfactuals would be an excellent possibility for somebody who wanted to do a mystery. So
I agree. I think that would be very neat.
So I'm going to ask the question that everybody's thinking. If they want to pitch you, how do they do it?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I have my email address and I'm going to put it in here. You are welcome to pitch or just send your novel or novella I do not take, like I said before, Dark Matter Inc. does not take stories that do not have a spec element. So it does need to have a fantasy, a science fiction, or a horror element. If you are writing like an alternate history, as much as it definitely can lean towards, in terms of like the mystery aspect itself, it needs to have probably a little bit more something else to it for dark matter to want it to have like some sort of dark edge to it, whether it's like darker horror edge or a little bit of fantasy. It does not have to be major. The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle is something that Dark Matter Inc. would take, even though the fantasy aspect of the Groundhog Day time travel, kind of like what Gary was talking about with the science fiction time travel, that's totally okay. But there does need to be something in there. So yeah, like you're welcome to pitch me. Simultaneous submissions are totally fine. No multiples, please. So I don't get too inundated with my submissions that I have to look through. And is there any other questions specifically that people need to ask about pitching or sending me anything? No?
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Well, thank you very much, Marie. Um,
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
we will, Marie, Nev, stay on the line a moment. Next month, I was going to do a piece on doing your own audiobooks, but I seem to have run into a wall with my latest audiobook because of software. So I'm not pitching old software, which worked very well. One of the things that happens with technology is they change things. It's like, why did you put the steering wheel on the right side of the car? I've been driving on the left for so long. Anyway, so we're going to be doing something else. I've been talking with Beth Mannion about doing a piece on her experience in publishing in Ireland. So that'll probably be next month's CrimeCraft. And then that'll be the end of the road for me because I'm coming to the end of my 4 allowable years on the board. So I will thank everybody then, but I'll thank those of you who are here now for making this work for me during this time. One final comment. Vincent, you talked about Alaska as a homeland. In the 1880s, I think 1860s, 1870s, there was talk of making Grand Island, New York, a home for Israel.
I remember that story as well, yes.
Yeah, and well, I say that because I'm in Buffalo, and
Mhm.
Grand Island is one of the largest freshwater islands in the world, and it is in the river. You have to go over it to go to Niagara Falls. It's Buffalo to Niagara Falls. The fastest route is over Grand Island, and my dad and my stepmom lived there for many years. And that's one of the and that my dad told me that when I was young. That really I didn't, and then I found the reference to it. And there was something that might have been worth speculating about. Anybody who wants to do that, you're welcome to do it. I'm not going to do that. I have some other things I'm working on. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank
And
you.
Yeah.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Lovely.
Dr. Marie. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Marie.
This
Much
is awesome.
appreciated.
And Nev?
Enjoyable. Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay, bye.